Hi. This is a Phyronasoma cornutum, I think. My pronunciation of scientific words is not as well as it could be. It's otherwise known as a Texas horny toad. Now, Texas horny toads are really cool. One thing that these guys do is if they're swallowed by a snake, they can actually inflate their bodies, lodge themselves in the throat of the snake until they get coughed up so they can run and hide under a rock and live to be caught by a snake on another day. A less well-known fact about these little guys, but equally interesting, at least to me, is that they're distantly related to dragons and equally difficult to catch. Now, how do I know this? I know this because when I was 9 years old, I wanted nothing more in the whole world than to catch a Texas horny toad, put it in a box under my bed, otherwise known as a horny toad habitat, having been carefully pre-prepared. Name it Frankie and keep it forever. At that point in my life, I'd spent approximately 7,548 hours running through the desert hunting the Texas horny toad. Now that's approximately the same number of hours, 7,548, that most kids will spend in a classroom before the age of 10. So what was I doing with that much time on my hand? 8 to 10 hours every day to sort of run through the desert unsupervised. I and my 5 younger siblings were being unschooled by my mother, a teacher, and also a social anarchist with a penchant for the unstructured. We were being unschooled. Now, really quick, what is unschooling? Because everybody's heard of crazy homeschoolers. Most of us have heard of Montessori schools, Waldorf schools, charter schools, music schools, and art schools. Unschooling is the idea that if you create an environment in which people can learn, they will. The role of the educator in an unschooled situation is simply to give people space. And as Pat Ferenga, an author, homeschool and unschooling advocate, and educator once stated, unschooling is parents giving kids as much freedom to explore on their own as those parents can comfortably bear. According to Wikipedia, unschooling is which is, as we all know, the source of all information in the world. Although there's a gender bias there that we might need to work on, Newnham. Unschooling is the creation of an environment where the people being educated decide what to learn and how to go about learning it. That means within an unschooling space, the goal is not to sort of prescribe what happens at what level, but to be ready to offer resources, time, and opportunity for kids or adults, because unschooling shouldn't end when you turn 18, who are ready to learn sort of the next best step. Most of my childhood was filled with museum visits. If we decided we were into dinosaurs, all of a sudden our house was full of books on dinosaurs. If everybody wanted to know what happened to the last Romanov princess, then my poor mom had to sit through a bunch of history on Russian literature and the revolution, which is something that she did very willingly. According to Ken Robinson, whose TED Talk, Schools Kill Creativity, the answer for education today is not to standardize education, but to personalize and customize it to the needs of each child and community. There is no alternative, and there never was. But now that we've defined unschooling just a little bit, what happens to kids who grow up in unschooling environments? I wrote some stats on my hands because I'm really, really bad at remembering stats. But first, before the stats, I've got some anecdotes. So I told you I have 5 younger siblings, which is a fairly large family by sort of British standards. There's 6 of us. And I'd like to say that we turned out more or less okay. I'm doing a PhD here at Cambridge. I've got a brother who's a filmmaker and wedding videographer. Another one who's worked at startups as a software engineer his entire career. My sisters, or one of them is still in university education. She's just 21. Another one is a professional structural firefighter. And another is a music teacher and songwriter. I like to think we've sort of done okay for ourselves. But I also know that I'm in a room full of people who potentially include researchers, educators yourselves, academics, or people like me who are sort of wannabe academics, kind of someday maybe. And anecdotes are not necessarily good enough on their own. So today, if you go to the United States, about 10% of kids are being homeschooled. That's about 1.77 million kids, give or take. Of that, less than 0.5% are being unschooled. When I was unschooled, in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, it was less than 0.5% of kids who were being homeschooled then were being unschooled. So my mother and educators like her were very much striking out into the dark. They had ideas about what education should be, but they didn't necessarily know how it was going to turn out. They were taking a pretty big risk and embracing a pretty big challenge. Today, Peter Gray, who's a researcher at Boston University, has been able to go back and look at some outcomes for some unschooled kids. He identified 75 people between the ages of 21 and 45 who were unschooled as kids and who are living in the Boston greater metro area today. And he found some really interesting things. He discovered that 83% of that cohort had been able to complete some level of university education. Most of them had started university education at the ages of 15 or 16, as the resources available to them at home had dwindled in comparison to what they wanted to learn, and they needed to branch out to sort of get into the fields that they were really fascinated by. 80% of those people worked in creative fields. They were people who were looking for challenges, things that they could do that would always have them sort of on the edge of what was upcoming and what was next. More than 40% of them worked in STEM fields at some point in their career, and 50% of them were entrepreneurs of some kind, having started a business or a not-for-profit at some point in their professional lives. And 100% of them said that they would seek out creative and meaningful work over ambition-driven or salary-driven work, because what fulfilled them was the ability to create creative environments and solve problems, not just for themselves, but also for the people that they worked with. Now, just to backpedal a little bit, I know I'm in a room full of people who were educated by good teachers in good schools, doing the best that they could to give people really good educations. My mom is today a teacher working with special needs kids in Western Oregon. She's taken her penchant for educating us and sort of continued her career as her kids have gotten to a point where we don't necessarily need somebody to tell us, is it time to sort of get up and look for something interesting? And I'm not saying that education or schools are bad. I'm just saying that it's an old system from an old world, and we're facing new kinds of challenges. Structured education, the way that we think of it today, where you go to a classroom and it's compulsory to be there 5 days a week, more or less 8 hours a day, first started around 1788 in Prussia. Schools had been around for about 100 years before that, but within the first century after compulsory education becoming legalized, almost all schools in Europe and across the United States, education was compulsory at least through the grade school level. And this was a really good idea. People were facing changes that they had never faced before. The Industrial Revolution had made the world a different place than people's families were used to. Rural farming populations were moving into cities. Factories were transforming the way that people lived, the way that they worked, the way that they purchased things, the way that they thought about the world. And railroads had taken an enormous world and made it tiny. We needed to take an illiterate population, make them literate. We needed to give people tools to grapple with problems that they had never grappled with before. And structured education was how we did that. And it worked really, really well. But 2088 is not 1789. And the challenges that we're facing today are really different in nature than the challenges that we used to face. We have climate change, global warming, massive inequality. We're thinking about gender and identity in ways that we've never thought about them before. And the internet means that everything moves incredibly quickly. We need to teach people how to be learning every single day of their lives, not just a particular skill set that will carry them through their lives. And unschooling, or not schools, or Sudbury model schools, which are set up like unschooling except in sort of traditional school environments, are ways to give people opportunities to think and to learn that might be a little bit better suited to a new world than the tools that we've been using in traditional educational models. And it's also an opportunity to give teachers a chance to engage with students on a more one-on-one basis and to think about those educational spaces in ways that aren't exhausting, draining, or that push them out of the profession. Now, if we look at what unschooling can do and what unschoolers become, we need people who can think outside of the box, who can continue to learn their entire adult lives, and who will follow each new obsession to wherever it takes them. And I might have grown up outside of a classroom, chasing horny toads through the desert, spending every single hour of every single day thinking about one little tiny thing at a time. But I never hated learning, and I never hated the idea of school once I started it. Because for me, as for many unschoolers, the world is a giant classroom, and every day is an opportunity to learn something new about a place that is never static. And I think that's the kind of gift that we need to start giving the next generation. Thank you.